Have you ever seen a coral reef? Up close, in person? Many can't say they have. These vibrant colonies come in all colors, shapes, and sizes and are typically found in clear, shallow tropical waters across the globe. Corals have existed for over 400 million years and are home to thousands of underwater species. But you might be surprised to hear that they aren't rocks or even plants, like many assume. They're animals.
They're these little polyps that are kind of like a sea anemone shape, but they also build outside of their body these limestone structures, and those structures are all different shapes and sizes and have holes and nooks and crannies, and so it really is like a city structure where tons and tons of animals find their homes in the different parts of the coral reef.
That's Dr. Julie Burwald, an ocean expert and author of the new book, Life on the Rocks, Building a Future for Coral Reefs. She says scientists estimate that around a quarter of all marine species live on coral reefs at some point in their life.
A lot of animals in the ocean have larvae forms, and then they mature into adults, like caterpillars into butterflies. And the larval forms of many, many marine species find their homes on the reef. So it's kind of like a nursery for marine creatures.
Without these reefs, many species wouldn't have a safe place to grow, mate, and thrive. Remember the Pixar movie Finding Nemo? Marlin and his son Nemo, who are clownfish, live in the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Queensland, Australia. The Great Barrier Reef is the largest coral reef system in the world, stretching over 1,400 miles. The early part of the film follows Nemo as he grows up in the protective walls of the colorful coral, surrounded by a bustling community of fish, crustaceans, and larger species like turtles, the living coral essentially acting as an underwater metropolis. So, what happens when this habitat disappears? To begin with, it jeopardizes the future of thousands of underwater animals. But humans also rely on coral too.
Because so many animals depend on the reefs, they grow up, a lot of them are fish, and they grow up to be fish that people catch. And so then it's estimated that between 500 million and 1 billion people rely on the reefs for their primary source of protein.
On top of this, coral reefs act as an important physical barrier between tropical land masses and violent ocean weather patterns.
The coral reefs act as a huge absorber of wave energy, and when storms come hurling at tropical islands, they can absorb like 97% of the energy from storms. They're the best wave barrier we know of.
Coral reefs play so many distinct roles that provide countless benefits to not only underwater species, but humans as well. However, in recent decades, as temperatures in the ocean warm, these organisms have been dying in record numbers in a phenomenon known as mass bleaching. To understand this occurrence, it's first important to have a basic knowledge of what these unique corals are made up of.
The coral animal itself actually has a translucent skeleton, a translucent body. And so you see, if there weren't these little tiny symbiotic algae called zooxanthellae living inside the coral, it's a symbiotic relationship, then all you would see is the clear coral, translucent, transparent coral animal over the white skeleton. So the color comes through this symbiotic relationship between the coral and the algae. And there are different types of zooxanthellae, and so there are different colors of coral.
That's Dr. Helen Fox, the Conservation Science Director at the Coral Reef Alliance. Fox highlights that the algae living inside the coral is part of an incredible symbiotic relationship that creates the bright, colorful reefs we see.
The plants photosynthesize, and that energy is basically food for the corals. But then the coral, because it's an animal, it makes waste, so nitrogen and phosphorus, just like human poop, basically. And that is like fertilizer for the plants. So that's how they grow. And also because of that process, that helps the coral animals secrete the calcium carbonate skeleton. So when you see a big boulder coral and then it grows, basically you're seeing it grows as it accretes, or branching corals, they grow and spread as the calcium carbonate accrete.
But when the environment changes, this symbiotic relationship comes to an end and the algae and coral separate, causing the coral to starve and change in color in a process known as bleaching. Burwald says that massive coral reef bleaching events were first observed in the 1980s, but since then have become more common.
When it first happened, I think scientists sort of thought it was a one-off, like, oh, there's a really bad El Nino this year that brought a heat wave across the Pacific Ocean, and that caused the corals to bleach over a huge swath of the ocean. But then in 1996, there was another one, and then in the early 2000s, there were more. And so I think the awareness that coral bleaching wasn't going away broke into the media's consciousness around that time in the early 2000s. And so there was a lot of coverage at that time. And since then, they haven't gone away. The mass bleachings just continue and continue.
Last month, scientists reported another mass bleaching event at Australia's Great Barrier Reef when water temperatures spiked for several weeks, creating marine heat wave conditions. This period turned large stretches of beautiful coral into a ghostly wash of white. While these events are becoming more frequent, experts like Burwald say that coral reefs can sometimes revive themselves after these events.
If the water cools down, the coral can be reinfected with algae and it will recover. And what we're finding in today's oceans, which is really fascinating, I think, is that sometimes the coral are being recolonized with a different kind of algae that actually has a higher thermotolerance, so it can stay in the coral at higher water temperatures. But this other kind of algae, it's a little more selfish, and it doesn't feed the coral nearly as much sugar, so only about 60% of the sugar that it makes. So the coral is teaming up with a new business partner, basically, who is paying it less rent. It's a tough trade-off, but it may be what the coral need to do to survive the warming seas.
Fox says that organizations like the Coral Reef Alliance are focused on protecting several areas of coral reef so they don't permanently die off before they have a chance to adapt.
Supporting diversity and keeping corals healthy in those areas through the threat reduction that we were talking about is the best way to support their evolutionary processes, so that hopefully in the long run, if we get our act in gear on climate change and those carbon emissions do start to drop rapidly and quickly, there will be the genetic diversity to help ensure that corals can evolve and adapt to the future conditions of the world.
Another threat to coral reefs is declining water quality caused by human activity. This pollution can also create an unstable environment for the corals and the many species living in the vicinity.
The human development, for example, if there is construction or logging, things like that, or agriculture, there's often runoff from that. And, when it rains, then there's dirt and silt and things like that that run off the land into the ocean. So I'm remembering I was diving once in the Solomon Islands for a research project, and you could see the former structure, like when I was talking about what it's like to dive among coral reefs, like you could see that there used to be this three-dimensional, beautiful structure of coral reef, but it was all covered with silt. And so there had been a lot of logging upland. And anytime it rained, instead of being clear water, it was basically like diving in soup. We could barely see because there was so much silt and runoff from that.
And Fox adds that there have been cases of human sewage making its way into the ocean, leading to greater rates of disease in corals.
That extra nitrogen and all of the things from untreated wastewater or agriculture, things like that, cause the algae to grow, the water to get murky, which isn't good for corals. And also a lot of that human wastewater includes pathogens. So there's been a big increase in coral diseases, and that has also been traced to basically mismanagement or lack of management of human sewage.
Burwald says that with the many challenges facing this species, some scientists are predicting that 99% of corals will be dead by 2050. While pollution plays a role in this, climate change is the biggest driver threatening the future of coral reefs.
Getting the heating of our planet under control is really, really the most important thing we can do for the health of the coral reef.
The decline of healthy coral reefs is a great loss to Earth's biodiversity and is just one of the countless negative impacts of climate change. To find out more about coral reefs and our guests, Dr. Julie Burwald and Dr. Helen Fox, visit viewpointsradio.org. You can also check out Burwald's new book, Life on the Rocks, available online and in bookstores now. To learn more about the Coral Reef Alliance, head to coral.org. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price. Coming up on Viewpoints.
There are people that you can reach out to cold and say, hey, I see that you talk about becoming a teacher. I'm thinking about becoming a teacher. Could I get a 15-minute virtual coffee with you? I have some questions I want to ask.
The importance of mentorship. Then,
have been very stagnant, and they've withheld raises as well as just raising base pay.
How workers are standing up and demanding more. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.